So as a way of introduction, I'd just like to brief quickly on inclusion and security risk management, and the long way I think it has come over the last years from what I would call a cookie cutter approach in the past, where basically the workforce, its diversity were not necessarily considered in security risk management, where we had a one size fits all, where all personnel were treated equally in terms of threats and risk in various operations. And it is evident that it is not the case, hence the session today, and discussing the differences on threats and risk to all humanitarian personnel based on who they are, where they work, who they work with. And this is why I think we're here today to look at the theory, the practice, the challenges, and how each of us, all of us, can push this forward, making sure that security risk management considers inclusion and a person-centered approach as not a wish, but a need in how we're looking at security risk management. So that's it. I will pass the floor to Susan. Oh, sorry, the housekeeping. Yes, so it will be, thank you, Susan. It will be a 90-minute session. It will be recorded so that you can go back to the main points later on. For online participants, please stay muted unless you have a question. Turn your camera on when you are asking the question, if possible. If you have any issue, then you can reach out in the chat. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please add them to the chat. I will be monitoring the small window, the chat window, and making sure that your questions are being passed on to the panelists as they appear. So thank you very much. And I think now with the housekeeping done, we can go on with the panel. So Susan, to you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Yes, before I start sharing some of the experiences from the Lutheran World Federation, just to introduce myself, my name is Suzanne Muis. I'm the Global Security Manager for the Lutheran World Federation since 2015. And I've been around 22 years in the sector. I've also been in the field, several field locations in Sudan and in Mali. So yes, I'm going to share with you some experiences from the headquarter perspective. So I'm talking about experiences in how the Lutheran World Federation here in Geneva has looked at inclusion and how, from the headquarter perspective, we've trying over the years to put things in practice. And I want to share with you some of the things we've done, and also some of the lessons learned and some of the challenges. So first, maybe before you talked about people-centered approach, well, in principle, that's part of in our values and in the way we work in programs too. I just want to show you one of the slides you can see over here, where you see the people are in the center of everything we do. We talked about diversity of the workforce, but we also talk about diversity in general with the people of concern. And therefore, we look at the rights and the specific organizational value we have, which is actually inclusion and diversity of one of them. So we provide support to people irrespective of race, religion, ethnicity, age, gender, sexual orientation, or political conviction without discrimination or favoritism. And we, of course, subscribe to the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. But also accountability, compassion, and commitment are part of the values that we as the organization have since 1946. So here you can see this also. So this demonstrates really where we focus on people also in different situations, refugees, internally displaced people in host communities, or specific people at risk. Here you can see some information regarding our workforce. We talked about diversity in our workforce, and you can see here that we have around 8,420 staff. It's actually a bit more now this year, but we're reaching 3.3 million people a year. And if you look at the division between the amount of staff, we mostly work with refugee staff themselves, incentive workers, people from the communities. We only have not even 1% of our staff is international staff. And our headquarters is quite lean. So it means for inclusion that we are really decentralized in the way we operate. We're really close to where the heart of the work happens. And of course, during the COVID pandemic, the whole stay and deliver approach was quite simple because there's so much, most of the work was done within the areas of operation. So taking that in the back of our mind, of course, we also we work in 24 countries, and we are working with different groups which also may face different risks, of course, in different societies. And therefore, all the security rules that we have set up from the policy that we have are non-discriminatory. And if there are specific risks for specific people, specific personal profiles, we always look for alternative and additional measures to be sure that people can be safe. So the integration of the contextual risks that we face, we always link them with the personal security profile or risks that people might have in risk assessments, which changes over time. Is not a one size fits all. See what you mentioned too. It's a constant process and a constant part of our security risk management principles. So, just one second. Yes. So, how then to put a theory into practice? So what have we done? Or have we tried? We are still doing actually. I think if looking back from the theory, I think of course mostly we talked about it earlier to a leadership and the senior management push for that coming from the headquarters in this specific case. In my role, reporting to the director of the World Service helps a lot. She's, of course, setting the example then to the rest of the organization, which is the country representative that we have in a 24-country program. So promoting that behavioral change is something that we try to do a lot and still are doing a lot. And of course, then also training and hiring. And that was also something that has been done more structured, the hiring and induction and also the assessment of new staff, looking at specific risk within the context, but also asking, getting more information about the persons that we will be hiring. But at the same time, also setting practical tools, like really standards for that people know that some people might face different risks, and they also know how to mitigate some of those. So really, it is a tailor-made approach, but at the same time, there are sort of standard mitigation measures that could be applied in all our field locations, 24 field locations. Then, of course, also the setting up of the security focal points within the country. So in field offices, not in the main office, but the capital office, but the field offices mostly, coaching them as well. And also what was another thing that we did is a lot focusing much more on tracking incidents and putting more awareness raising about the need for reporting those incidents because things are getting forgotten and people moving on. We are quite an action-oriented organization. So we always look at today and tomorrow, but we sometimes forget to look back. And then we might not capture all the specific risk we might have identified. Then another one, so the tailor-made briefings is also something that we've done, and training also staff in how to do those briefings, and in a dialogue with the persons that might be sent into risky areas, whether it's a deployment or whether it's a field trip or whether it's opening a new office in a new part of the country, which has different sets of risks. But we also try to put a bit of responsibility as well to the person we are sending out or the person that are going to be exposed to specific risks. And that's why the informed consent became very important. So that not only from a legal point of view, like the person knows the risks, but also as a moral responsibility, say the staff needs to know about the risks. And another aspect as well that we try to underline here as well is the whole issue around complaints response and safeguarding and protecting whistleblowers and the security and security risk that they might be exposed to by actually speaking out about something. So all this happened over the years, and it's still needed. It's not finished. It's never finished, I think. That's what I believe. You need to remind people, and things are changing. But what we tried to push for in LWF was to start integrating the safety and security, promoting safety and security in our code of conduct. And this has recently been done in only the staff code of conduct from February this year, has a section, and you can see it here on the slide, where we try to be clear about what staff must do and what they never must be doing. And I think this also came from the fact that there were certain breaches of safety and security rules that have endangered staff and other people too. And we wanted to avoid that and bring also that responsibility back. So that was also one of those things we tried to integrate. Yeah, and of course, this whole code of conduct rollout had also an online training available for them. Moving to the lessons learned then, that's the second part. And of course, there are a lot of lessons learned, and we are still, of course, recently having the code of conduct, and you can already understand the discussions we have with our country programs. What does it actually mean? Of course, we have rules and regulations, but also when it comes to inclusion, also the perception of risk or the risk appetite or the way how those risks have been assessed can differ for sure. So it's also like it has not been, I have not been told, it has not been really clear. But anyway, just as one of the lessons learned, again here, I think senior management team to promote from headquarters is very key. And also to set the example for the management teams in the country programs. Inclusion also to be part of whether that's in our policy, in our code of conduct now, in our values as the organization, that we also always have to assess the probability and impact of certain threats. For example, what we've seen in Tigray at a certain moment in time, we are not able to send some of our Amhara staff to the Tigrayan region because it would have been very risky for them, of course. Also in Haiti lately, we had to withdraw our international Burundian staff just for the time being because the person was not able to go outside of Port-au-Prince and you know, find other support from family members there. So those kind of things, of course, are still happening. So the whole inclusion discussion, of course, the main is to cause, we have of course learned as well, we don't want to do harm for persons, but of course there's also an element of reputation. We also want, from the values and the people-centered approach, we don't want to do harm to what we believe is important. So that's another, and we take the duty of care very seriously because we want to protect staff and visitors, because otherwise we cannot do the work, which is the core of our existence, as I showed you in the first slide. Other lessons learned as well is that building the capacity of the security focal points to guide them in inclusive risk assessments and identify different risks takes time and needs a lot of repetition. That's of course also quite common. And again, I think I'm a strong believer in behavior takes time, and behavior needs as much attention, because the challenge we face is the increased compliance by our partners in the duty of care, legally also. But in the end, it's about the behavior of staff, which can make a big difference, even if you know the risks about people's personal risks. You still need to promote that the person will be protected. So I think that's a bit. There are more lessons learned to be shared, but I just want to stop here, and thank you very much.
So thank you, Susan. I think as we go on with the various panelist members, we'll be able to draw on those lessons learned at various levels. But thank you for the approach, the HQ approach, and your efforts on inclusion in security risk management and inclusion in general. And now I'll pass to Jean-Phillipe from the ICRC on his experience.
Merci, Eric. Thank you, Eric. This translation. So my name is Jean-Phillipe. I've been working at the ICRC for quite some time now, and more specifically in security and crisis management support for the last 7 years. Currently, I'm the deputy head of unit. We are sitting in the Department of Operations, and it just happens that inclusive security, risk management, and person-centered approach turn out to be a topic of, I would say, dear interest for us the last few years. This is actually our third time joining GISF and HNPW on that specific topic. So I will try not to repeat myself. Here in that slide, actually one of the links that can be used, because the hyperlinks to the pictures takes to the very first session we supported on the topic, and I think last year's session was also is also available still online. So here is for me, the idea was first to respond positively to Lisa's invitation to be part of this panel, but also to see how to talk about what's the place of the individual based on the various developments the organization has made to make, I would say, duty of care and all related duty of care related, I would say, a need for information for people in order to do their own self-assessments in a way. So for me, I'm going to go venture into that because it's actually something we haven't really talked much about the last couple of years. But just as a reminder, so the ICRC works operates in environments that we know where trust and access take time to build. This is not new. Misperception can go a long way into disrupting humanitarian activities. And here, for instance, neutrality, which is one of the ICRC's fundamental operating principles, is key. It provides safeguarding against taking sides in hostilities or controversies of various natures, be it political, be it racial, religious, or ideological. So one of the concrete implications of this principle in terms of how we operate is that the ICRC does not expose its national staff to certain types of activities that are sensitive in nature. And that is the case, for instance, with confidential dialogue that the ICRC has with parties to the conflict in order to uphold the application of international humanitarian law. But this obviously has implications on the type of duty of care the ICRC has as an employer, because there is no such thing as zero risk, right? And from a contracting perspective, any individual aspiring to do this great work must understand that. And that's part of informed consent. So it doesn't mean that the absence of zero risk absolves the humanitarian organizations from its duties. And here, just as any employer, the ICRC has a duty of care to take all reasonable measures to protect its staff from foreseeable risks. And so here, it's not so easy and it's not as straightforward. We start seeing that everybody has, I would say, duties, obligations from the employer side and from the employee side. So we started kind of deep diving into the person-centered approach at the end of 2020. Again, I think prompted by some of the workshops that GISF had done that year. And this was for us a good way to do a bit of a health check on methodologies that we had introduced as well in terms of security risk management. We wanted something more collective in the approach that would ensure, I would say, a wider diversity and inclusion in terms of perspectives, skills, types of contracts. Whoever sits in a specific context may have something to say about the security environment. And so the idea was really pushing for this, and we had been doing this for a few years now. And looking into that, we realized again that we were facing something that had not been researched enough, which was how did the individuals feel into the process? And so clearly, as mentioned, all staff do not experience risks equally. Their personal security is impacted by the interplay between their personal profile, so who they are, the context, which is where they are, and their role, what are they asked to do. And clarity on all these aspects are therefore needed. And here everyone has a role to play. We keep saying security is the responsibility of everybody, but from the employer's capacity to inform, especially on the context, on the role, to the employee's capacity to self-assess and behave accordingly, according to code of conduct, but also according to the security rules that are in place in that specific assignment. I have something I wanted to show you quite. Is next slide, yeah. Right. So last year we kind of played on the right hand of that slide, which were basically the broad recommendations that came out of a internal research we did 2 years ago, where we were looking at really not only from a security perspective, it's not only my unit, but I also need to work with colleagues that are working in the human resource department, with the D&I, outfit that we also have at headquarters, and other aspects related to, from basically from recruitment to onboarding to briefing, debriefing, and everything that goes around it. Here, I think in terms of where we are now, it's lots of those broad recommendations are still being worked on. We are now about to start a new briefing, debriefing system where all the information that people need to have before actually saying yes and going ahead with their planification is going to be staged in a new process, especially for the briefing. But something that we were missing was also a more systematic debriefing system where we could learn from the how effectively the person-centered approach is implemented at field level, because not everybody has the same experience. So that's, I will stop here. We will probably have, I think in the Q&A, a bit more input there. And if needed, I can come back on some of the recommendations I mentioned and talked about at length last year. Thank you.
All right. So again, thank you, Jean-Phillipe. A good example of the not only the risk assessment, which was tackled in it, but the entire person-centered approach. And so two views, which are not dissimilar in a way, looking at inclusion and security risk management. And then I will pass the microphone, rather, or open the floor for the third panelist, Mark Wallis.
Thank you. Could we get Jean-Phillipe's slide back on? If I could borrow your slide. I met Jean-Phillipe last year at this conference and immediately identified a fellow traveler, right? Somebody that we're on a similar voyage. So I think that slide is going to be useful for me. My name is Mark Wallis. I'm the Humanitarian Access, Safety and Security Team Lead for the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance with USAID. So fair warning to everyone here, I am a part of a donor organization. And I'm going to be talking about some things that are fairly specific to USAID. And I'm going to rely on the idea that this is a safe space here and that what's said in Geneva stays in Geneva. And perhaps those of you that are virtually out there listening to this, you're virtually in Geneva. So I'm holding you to the same standard. My background was 20 years of police service investigating predominantly sexual violence. And that was predominantly sexual violence against women and children. I worked for one terrible year as a security contractor in Afghanistan, then realized I was becoming an old man who needed to find a way into heaven. So I worked for US Peace Corps as a security advisor, and I've spent the last 6 years doing humanitarian security at USAID. So I think I have a certain diversity of experience there inside of a not very diverse person. But the reason I'm saying that is context. To me, context is everything, right? Or maybe I should start with, let's look at that, the graphic on the right, the person-centered approach, right? If we're going to talk about inclusion, the first thing I would suggest is that we include the whole person, right? Because most of us who are technicians in safety and security, if we come especially from the hard skills world, the police, the military, or high threat environments, we think in terms of physical safety, right? Physical security. And I think we prioritize that. And if anybody here knows anything about trauma, right? Or trauma-informed responses, trauma-informed support, there are a lot of things that happen to people emotionally that have just as much impact as being threatened with physical violence, right? With being injured, with seeing injuries of others. The experts that I know say trauma is trauma is trauma. It's all the same. It's cumulative, right? And it has a different impact on every individual person. So we can't treat safety and security response or safety and security planning as just a hard skills safety and security issue. We have to look at the whole person, I think, and recognize if we shift over to context, that context, as Jean-Phillipe said and as Susan said, is specific to every person, right? So we look at every individual and realize that what our contingency planning looks like, what our response planning looks like, and potentially what our long-term support in duty of care looks like is somewhat or must be tailored somewhat to that context for every person. And I'll tell you that my organization is struggling with this. So I have two responsibilities. One, I manage a modest grant portfolio that's about analyzing safety and security information for NGOs, for humanitarians, and for promoting safety and security best practices, professionalism. But I also have direct responsibility for the safety and security of about 1,000 people in my bureau. And at any one time, there are 40 or 50 of them that are deployed in fairly high threat places. And sometimes I deploy with them. So I think have despite the fact that I'm part of a donor organization, I know what it's like to support people in jeopardy in the field. It's a very real responsibility for me. And so that's what I was going to talk about in terms of examples. It'll be a fairly low-key example. USAID responded within the first week of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We didn't get into Ukraine itself. We ended up in Poland on the border because logistically this made sense for us. And my experience in Syria, in Afghanistan, in South Sudan, in northeastern Nigeria, when I land in southeastern Poland, I'm pretty comfortable, right? Poland, I think I would deploy to Geneva or Munich and it would feel very similar, right? And most of our team felt that way. This was a very low threat, very low impact humanitarian response, except for the people on our team who are persons of color, right? Or have gender identity or orientation that are different than the majority group. Their experience in southeastern Poland was very, very different. And I think our organization struggled to recognize it at first. And then we also struggled to recognize the impact that that had on people individually. And I'll give you the best example, okay? A woman of color in my team, I was already gone. I set up the safety and security system. There wasn't a safety and security coordinator focal point there at the time. Had a mentally ill person off the street come in and rub her skin to try to rub the color off of her skin, right? And then he put his fingers in her hair. And the hotel, this was a hotel and conference space. Hotel staff didn't know what to do. They didn't do anything. And the team, yes, it's so bad you either want to laugh or cry, right? And when she described the experience, the organization looked at, again, hard skills, safety, and security. Was this person ultimately a threat to her physical safety? And when she answered the question no, she couldn't finish, say no, but the impact was significant. The impact was very large. And the organization wasn't ready to provide that level of support, right? How do we treat that whole person? Because a US government official assessed the threat as low, and from a strictly anticipation of violence, yeah, the threat was probably low. But we didn't count on a couple of things. In my experience, and I'm sure in some of your experiences, if you take a group, a homogenous group with no outliers, right? Everybody's, let's say, the same gender. Everybody is the same level of training. You can put them in a very high threat environment, take police or military, and they tend to do fairly well for an extended period. But if you have anybody that's vulnerable in that team, anybody who's not taken care of, what the affinity group does or does not do for those outliers, for those people that are not part of the dominant group, is potentially very damaging. What I mean is their needs or their perceptions are not validated. They're invalidated because they hear their peers say, this place is great. This place is fine. There's no problems. Yeah, for me, right? But not for somebody who's outside the group. And so we actually have an outsized impact on those potentially traumatic events based on how we react, right? As an affinity group, as an organization. And what I heard in the aftermath of this incident specifically was, well, safety and security is a personal responsibility. So she needs to know how to deal with that because she is aware of her own identity. She knows her own capabilities. And I would argue, yes, safety and security is a personal responsibility, but there's an organizational responsibility under duty of care to identify the gaps, right? And to look at an incident and say, something basic like, do you need support? And what does that support look like to you, right? That's actually a fairly simple set of questions. It's potentially not an awkward conversation to have. For my organization, it was really difficult to have that conversation. We've spent years talking about sexual violence, and somehow we are comfortable talking about that, but we're not ready necessarily. And this is, I would say, a reflection of US society, right? We're not necessarily ready to speak about race. We're not ready to speak about orientation or gender identity because we haven't had enough practice at it. And what I found in southeastern Poland was it was as if all of the progress we made in the last decade, 2 decades in safety and security sort of slipped away a little bit because we were confronted with a slightly different problem set, right? And we couldn't recognize that context that we see, right? That perfect Venn diagram there of the role of the organization, the personal profile, the context. We moved those around a little bit and we thought it was a different situation than it was. Does this make sense? So we started a conversation with all of the people that believed they had vulnerabilities here, people that were interested in deploying to southeastern Poland, people that had come back. We did what Jean-Phillipe did, is we systematized a debriefing process because we thought that was really important. to capture what this experience is like. I think the one thing of value that I could add to people is I think I know how to talk about these issues with a 26-year-old woman of color, but am I the best person to have that conversation with her? I'm willing to have it. But what I also recognized we had was a wealth of experience on our team, right? We had every other person who identified potentially as a marginalized group. I approached people and said, would you be willing to talk to the next people who deploy? So this is informed consent, right? I'm not necessarily the best informant for what this experience feels like because I'm 59 years old. And in Poland, at worst, I look like a German, right? I don't look like a foreigner. So I started to facilitate conversations between two persons who might have similar views of the world and might have useful, concrete examples of how they coped with this. And the way I framed that was I said, it is not your responsibility to fix this issue. It's not your responsibility to solve this problem. But would you like to speak to somebody who can speak much more personally about what this experience feels like? And I approached people on the team and said, are you willing to be a resource? I'm not going to make you're not being burdened with security issues, but if there's something you feel strongly about, would you like to share it? The model seemed to work fairly well, and it repaired a little bit of damage, I think, that our organization had in terms of credibility and demonstrating that you care, right? I think there's a difference. Duty of care is a legal term. Demonstrating that you care is slightly different. And I'll stop after this. I would say one of the big mistakes that we make about duty of care and demonstrating care is we love vision statements and boilerplate language that says things like the safety and security of our employees is our top priority. The support of our employees is our top priority. Well, we wouldn't send them to dangerous places if that were really true, right? But our top priority is getting the humanitarian mission accomplished. So don't rely on the language, right? It's something in social work and in domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence. It's called safety planning. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the concept, but in social work, we're not talking about physical safety planning by and large. We're talking about emotional safety, recognizing that there is no difference between those two. Someone who is emotionally vulnerable is physiologically and psychologically as impacted as somebody who is exposed to direct danger. There's 40 years of hard science on this. The impact can be the same. So we start with safety planning of it's those two questions. Do you need support? And what does that support look like to you? So if we're worried about an offender coming in off the street, what would you like us to do? Can we talk to the hotel staff about keeping street people, homeless people, mentally ill people out of the hotel? Can we talk about who we would put as the gatekeeper for our conference space so that we don't have unauthorized people coming into this space? What is it that you would like to get from your group, your affinity group, from your organization? What does that support look like? It's not that difficult a conversation, I think. And it's potentially a very rich conversation when you stop looking at the diversity of your team as a liability and you look at the diversity of your team as an asset, because the solution is somewhere. If we get all into a room like this, there's a solution at the table. There's somebody who can actually tell you, if that happened to me, this is what I would want. I would want to hear you say. I would appreciate it if you would not say these other things, like it wasn't that bad, or at least he didn't hurt you. Don't say the things that we sometimes say. So you've got a very simple solution that revolves a lot around conversations. If you're willing to have the conversations and you're willing to admit what you don't know. And for this room, I'll be vulnerable for a second and I'll say, I think I know some things about inclusion and diversity around sexual violence, and I'm getting there when we start talking about race. I think I'm there with LGBTQ vulnerabilities. I don't know that I'm ready to have a conversation about people who are differently abled, right? Who have physical abilities that are different from mine. I don't know if I'm ready to have a conversation with people who are neurodivergent, right? So those are accommodation levels. I don't know if this is an issue in Europe, but in the US, we haven't even begun to talk seriously about how to address access for physical challenges. And I don't think we really talk much about neuro challenges, right? So I bet if we had a conversation, we had enough time, there's a solution in this room on that as well. Or, one of you, if you don't know it, you know somebody, you know a guy, you know a gal that you can talk to. So I guess that was my approach. We haven't fixed it yet, but the conversation being an honest conversation, the feedback that we got from a larger group in our organization, both in the US and based in the field, they just said, thank you for starting the conversation. I feel better now. We feel better now because people are speaking honestly about this. And the organization needs to be prepared to admit in front of its staff, potentially, what we don't know. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mark. A lot on this, and I think it raises a point. I mean, Susan raised or used the behavioral change, Jean-Phillipe as well, and we were discussing just before the panel on this, is how on the case you gave, and I faced a similar situation in a country where one obvious threat was not considered in security risk management. How do we go past this hurdle? How do we make sure that the people who are in charge of looking at security risk have, I don't want to say an open mind because they probably have it, but do consider things that are outside of their comfort zone? Yeah, and this is a challenge that you faced, or probably the people who did this did not look at a particular risk to somebody of a particular ethnic background in southern Poland. I happen to be in a country in the Middle East where, after a thorough review of an SRM, sexual assault was never ever mentioned, because the people in the room were probably not comfortable doing it. So how do we tackle this? How do we ensure that through training, through behavioral change, UNHCR does it through person-centered approach trainings, but we're still not necessarily seeing the results in our documents, and therefore the people are not aware of the potential risks they're facing, and it's a mutually reinforcing issue. You don't know the risk, you fail to report it when something happens, therefore it doesn't come back, and it doesn't come back to inform a revision of an SRM. So how do we do this? What are the approaches that you've taken, maybe Susan or Jean-Phillipe, on passing this hurdle of behavioral change training, ensuring that inclusion in security risk management, at least on the risk assessment, is done thoroughly?
Yes, it's a very good question, and I think we are still, as you said, it's still work in progress. I think the last time GISF organized something was the training session in December, where we had a discussion on how to operationalize inclusive security risk management. That's actually when I met Susan online. Yeah, right. And here a few points. I think ICRC, what we started working on, also because as the research was underway and we were discovering that in large majority, I would say, our colleagues were telling us that there was insufficient consultation with colleagues from a diverse range of personal profiles in the development of security-related policies and practices. We had to do something about this. So what I showed earlier about the broad, I would say, topics in terms of recommendations, we had to look at them and say, okay, where do we start, and what do we control ourselves as security and unit, and what has to be worked out with other internal stakeholders, because we are not in charge of the entire organization, unfortunately. So here I would say for the trainings, the fact that we were in full-on COVID-19 and had to change as well the way we were training people, in a way gave us a bit more flexibility to look into how to inject new modules. So our main responsibility, my unit, is basically training managers to do security risk assessments, because it's site managers that are responsible for security in the field. We may have from time to time a security coordinator out there to help for especially like the bigger types of operations, to help ensure that there is a homogeneous way of dealing with it. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the site manager being in charge. So they need to be equipped. And we started to introduce the person-centered approach. First, it was kind of a separate module until we realized that there was a problem with that, and we had to integrate it into the actual topic of security risk assessments in order not to make it a different thing or an additional layer, but just make sure that this is part of how it should be done. That's interesting because I think when you have managers coming from different countries and they can do also peer-to-peer, that's you will basically prepare your session in a way where you will identify at least one context where something had happened, where you can rely on your lessons learned in a way and say, okay, or what Mark was saying, you take the example of Ukraine and people of color in Poland and see how to start there. And the conversation, of course, at the beginning is going to go, we're going to have people basically saying, okay, but we're not responsible for recruiting people. No, you're not. But you're supposed, what you're responsible of is basically making sure that the way operations are done in your site or done in as safe manner as possible for your staff. So how do you go about this? It's always about changing a bit the answer. The response doesn't come from the trainers necessarily, as you know, when you've been doing some trainings, is that you need to rely on who is in the group and experiences that they have faced, and sometimes work with them some solutions, some alternative ways of actually pulling that information so that they are able to have a clearer view on the different aspects when it comes to profile specific risks. And this works. And this is going to affect, I would say, 20, 25 people. You repeat it and it's going to take some time, but at the end of the day, what we are looking at is also incremental changes through generational changes. And that's also a reality. That's one aspect, I would say, of how we've been tackling it from a training perspective. But we've also tried to look at other ways to make the topic pop up in other types of documents that we actually don't control. And I was talking earlier about the debriefing system. What is important for us is to look at what type of information do we consider to be necessary and be done systematically. So if you look at your country briefing, whoever is in charge of this, like sometimes people, certain organizations have different departments will be basically responsible for drawing kind of what will be the content in terms of information related to a country. Well, maybe you want to make sure there is a sort of section here in terms of what would profile specific risks come from, and so here you have a wide range of profile specific risks to look into, and you can, as an organization, decide to make it more systematic.
Thank you, Jean-Phillipe. Susan, on the subject.
Yes, on the personal, I agree with you, JP, what you said. I think one of the challenges sometimes is that if for example, you have, whether it's in a briefing session or during recruitment process, of course, the role of HR is very key in knowing, of course, the candidate also well. But what I found difficult also is to respect the privacy of the person. And so what I'm normally doing is then to have an open discussion and try to find out what the person has experienced. And for example, what you mentioned about traumas and PTSD kind of, or specific countries that a person has experienced. I mean, that's it. Of course, within the discussion, you will find out a bit more. But then the question, we had it, for example, with the COVID vaccination, where we couldn't ask whether people are vaccinated or not, but we have promoting it from an organization a lot because we want to protect also the people we work with, including our staff. But so So the way, and when it comes to other specific risk, whether it's related to specific ethnicity or clans in Somalia, for example, it's really hard also to, we mentioned it then more in the way of the contextual risks, so that the person is prepared about what kind of exposure he or she will be facing. So I think then it's a more of the indirect approach, but I'm not saying it is correct. And I agree with you, certain things we might need to speak up more in the open. I think also the role of human resources here is very key in this. And of course, all the other ways we do when hiring staff. And then also within the line management process, and I've been struggling too sometimes in saying, okay, this is going to be a risk, right, for the person. You have to respect the wish of the person, but on the other hand, you also have to calculate from the organization, are we going to create more problems for the person while sending this person out or going for this visit now because of the stress level is very high, we shouldn't do it. And then it goes into the line management approach. And that's also within the policy, we have that line management approach as a principle that they in the end need to make the final decision and saying, I don't think the person is fit to go. Even though the information shared is a personal information, you have to also respect the privacy of the person. I think that's the way how to go around it. I'm not saying that's the solution, but that's the practice in our situation. But then again, and this diverse profile study is really good. It's good to start a debate, as you said, about sexual harassment and sexual violence. What we've done in several country programs is a gender security training sessions. We go and discuss about, does it happen in the workplace, for example? Does it happen in the field? And then you see a big difference between what some of our male colleagues are saying and the female colleagues are saying. So it's also something about culture. So that we have come from far in getting that open, but I think there's much more to be done.
All right, so I think I'd like to thank the 4 panelists for their intervention. Thank you very much. And I think we can open the floor now for questions, either in the room or online. So I would ask, as we said at the beginning, please write your question in the chat. I will be monitoring the window and raising the question, and then we panelists will go. So we have a question in the room. Sure. Please go ahead.
Hi, James Davis, Women for Women International. And I wanted to pose a question to Susan, because something I saw in her presentation kind of sparked the thought, but happy to hear from Mark and JP as well. One of the things about inclusivity, and what we were just talking about a moment ago was more personal, but I'm talking cultural inclusivity in organizations. A lot of things about inclusivity are related to where the center of gravity in an organization is. And the center of gravity tends to be in headquarters. In Susan's slide, she was saying that security risk management has to be a tailor-made approach, because in every context, there are all sorts of variations that are going to impact your security risk management. But a lot of the other things we do, like code of conducts, are not tailor-made. Code of conduct is established typically in a northern context, or if we want to put it in those terms, in a colonial way, where the Europeans or the North Americans establish what is right and what is wrong. I have yet to come across an organization that had its code of conduct drafted in the Middle East or East Africa and then presented to the global organization and adopted as is. And so inclusivity has to be cultural as well. And I was wondering if, especially LWF, as an organization that only has 0.7% international staff out of 8,000, how you address this kind of center of gravity of inclusion organizationally.
Yes, good question. So I was indeed the way we are structured. Of course, we are a global federation. So even the headquarters is a mixture of people from all over the world, from Latin America, from Africa. I'm the only Dutch, for example. There are no other Dutch in the organization. I think the code of conduct, therefore, is also being approved by our council. So there's a council. There are 148 member churches that are the federation, and in 99 countries. So in the principle, that's also the people said we are the way the governance structure is, we are not a Swiss-based governance structure. We are a worldwide federation. And I think that makes automatically also the code of conduct not so much what is headquartered then. It's a global organization. So it's supposed to be here in Switzerland, but it could be everywhere. And I think that's where also inclusion comes within the whole setup of this, and all the governance structures we have to approve. This process has been a very long process. So that already in itself helps, of course, to roll it out. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. And then the 1% of our international staff are mostly staff from within the regions. So, for example, we have a lot of people from the DRC working in the Central African Republic and in Chad, for example. So they're all from the same regions. I think that helps a lot to bring in all the sort of the global perspective within this within the rolling out of this code of conduct.
I don't have any question in the meeting chat. So is there any other question here on Lisa?
About Mark, you were talking about looking for somebody of a similar experience to share their experiences. But there has been this debate about why is it always the person of color who has to stand up for different ethnicities in the inclusion discussion? Why does it have to be the woman who talks about sexual harassment and violence? And I'm just curious about where do we go with that conversation, really, about recognizing the importance of shared experience, but not putting the responsibility on those and not going, well, I'm white, I'm sorry, I can't talk about color. It's too embarrassing for me to talk about it. How do we get over that?
So as the person who brought this up, yeah, I was very careful how I framed it because I was very sensitive to the fact that I didn't want to be saying, this is your problem to solve, right? This truly, I believe, is an organizational problem to solve. But you run that risk, right? So what I offered that was as an alternative, if you would like to explore this more. I started with my briefing and used the rule that I was taught starting in 1987 as an investigator is don't characterize behavior or actions, describe them. So I wouldn't necessarily talk about xenophobia or racism or things like that. I would describe the behavior you see on the street. Right. So this is what we saw, and we did see this directed at LGBTQ. We saw this directed at gender specific or racial specific, and then say, do you have any concerns about that? If the conversation went in depth, would you like to speak to somebody else about this? There's somebody who might have a better informed perspective than I do. So I never want to be that I can't talk about this because I just don't have the right perspective, but I was always clear that there was more information out there. It was also very much dependent, frankly, on the people that come back from those experiences. Do they want to share their experiences, right? So that approach to me has to be very careful as well, is you're potentially speaking to somebody who's had a very negative experience and wasn't supported well. And you don't necessarily want to burden them with having to relive that with another person. And again, that idea of you're now responsible for preparing other people. So yeah, I think it was how I framed it. But I was listening very, very carefully for feedback that would suggest that was the narrative was, okay, they're just putting it back on us. Lauren and I and my shop have a pretty good relationship because we're participating in almost every DEIA activity in our organization. And I would recommend that for anybody in security. I don't know how we can do security without DEIA. I don't know how if we can't talk about that, how can we talk about anything else in security, right? And how do we expect anyone to report if it's not safe to raise your hand and talk about issues around race or gender or orientation, how are we going to necessarily talk about intimate, private details that somebody might have to disclose if they've suffered a violent crime? To me, we start at DEIA. So we had already, I think, a relationship where we had a guaranteed feedback loop that if we were messing it up, we were going to hear about it. And so I would say that's what we all need to do, right? Is have these conversations and these established relationships way before you start addressing the specific context in a specific country. You should already have a level of trust. You should already have a track record of taking negative feedback, taking criticism, and taking responsibility for it. I didn't say that earlier, but I apologized to the people in southeastern Poland who had negative experiences and negative support. I don't feel like I personally set them up for failure. I don't feel like I played a significant part in doing that, but I took responsibility for it because I'm safety and security. And I said, I'm sorry. That was the first thing. I am sorry this happened. I wish that we had a better set of instructions, a better information set for you before you went out on this trip. And the feedback that we got was that actually the prior relationship and apologizing. And I'm not apologizing for my organization. There were senior leaders in my organization that were not as apologetic or conciliatory, had to do a little bit of making up ground for them, right? Because a lot of our senior leadership are all, and are the certain entities, whether they're HR or whether they're general counsel, they're designed to protect the agency, right? They're designed to protect the organization, not to protect the individual. So anything that we do that's expressly for the protection of the individual, I find is generally well received, and it's refreshing for people as they say, we haven't seen this before. So I don't know if that answered the question or not.
I mean, to speak to something that is part of my work as well, I think in order to empower people to be able to raise various threats that may not happen to your type of individual, I think it's where data plays a role as well. I mean, if you can get all of the data throughout time, all right, highlighting a particular threat that doesn't apply to me, but that would apply to a colleague because of a particular characteristic, well, then it makes me a little bit more comfortable discussing something that I would not necessarily be comfortable. And I think it's important. When I was raising the issue or pointing the example of a country in the Middle East where sexual assault was never mentioned by male security advisors, the first question that came on the table was, but how often does it happen? And if you have the data, it makes the conversation a little bit easier to have. It's still a very uncomfortable discussion you may have, but this data may allow you to say, no, it is happening. And I'm may not be comfortable discussing it, but at least now I've got something to say that it is happening. And therefore, as a security professional, I need to consider it for face value. It is happening, it's there. I need to include it in my security management and find mitigation measures. There I can rely on maybe a technical assistance outside. But I think it's critical. And within the UN, this is a work we're trying to do on both the SRM, but also on our information incident reporting system, where we're making sure that we're collecting the data. That, of course, there is, it's victim-centered, it's consent, but we are getting this data, aggregating it, and being able to go back to operation and say, this was not featured in your risk management, but it should, because it is happening, whether you like it or not, whether you were able or not comfortable highlighting it or assessing it, you need to now take it into consideration. And I'm convinced that before your case in South Poland, had you looked at data, and there's no blame, but had you looked at data, you would have seen that unfortunately in some parts of the world, and I happened to work in Kosovo at one point where the civilian police officers that worked in Kosovo under a UN mandate were often the subject of harassment, racism by the local population. It's there. We have the data. It needs time and effort to get that data in order to make that uncomfortable discussion maybe a little bit more data centered and easier to have.
I would just offer that that also speaks directly to informed consent, right? When you provide that data, you're essentially that's one of those building blocks of informed consent. Absolutely.
Okay, so I still do not have any question. So it's evidently that we've been very clear. We do have another question. I was sorry.
I was going to ask one more quick question out of JP based on something he said during his presentation. You were saying that you don't employ national staff in a role that would put them at risk. I was just wondering, do you include inclusion in your project risk assessments when you're looking at a new project? And does it go beyond national staff and their risk profile, or is it inclusion part of the risk assessment process for ICRC across a broad range of those inclusion factors like gender, race, LGBTQ? And if it is, because ICRC is kind of huge, neutral, international organization, how do you address all those privacy issues if you are including inclusion in broad risk assessments for operations?
All right. Thanks for that one. I think it's not so easy to answer without giving some examples. So I'll start with that. Right. So it's interesting, the word inclusion, the way we actually understood it a few years ago when we developed like a new SSRM methodology, was to say, look, inclusion is about making sure that everybody has a voice during the exercise in the first place. So we were looking at it really from a contextualized perspective and breaking it down per site and say, okay, you're in Khartoum, you have your team, the people that actually work in Khartoum, they may be international staff, there may be national staff, sit around the table, do your exercise, but we need everybody to be, kind of around the table and have a voice. The diversity being who they are, the different roles, experience, skills and stuff, and then inclusion being the fact that they can participate and contribute. We don't have a system where projects will have a specific risk assessment necessarily. What we are going to work on first is more like the area and areas of operations. So basically where we work, multi-teams, multi-objectives, and it's mostly from an objective perspective. So this is what we need to do, what are the risks we are going to face. And then it's when we actually look into the sources of risk that we are going to fine-tune the person-centered approach. Because the connection here is interesting, no? Is that profile-specific risks can turn to be actually at a macro perspective sources of risk, and so you need to know that so that you can adjust and fine-tune your mitigation measures. And this is how most of the conversation takes place. Now, there are things for years and years, almost from the beginning, I would say, certain type of activities by default are only done by international staff. And that's going to be, for instance, when you have to meet with the military, or mostly the military, and you need to speak about international humanitarian law violations. We don't want to expose national staff to their own authorities on this, and that's a purely that's how neutrality is also understood and implemented in those contexts. But that's basically by default. Now, there's been, I think, over the years, some adaptations to that. For instance, if I look at detention work, in certain places of detention, we may have national staff that work in places of detention, but on very, I would say, non-threatening in a way capacities, either to help on water and habitat type of activities, or even health related when we talk about primary health care, for instance. But anything else that will be more onto harder types of topic will by default include an international staff to actually do that work. But does that answer your question?
A little bit.
A little bit.
It's more, okay, well, let's say, for example, then you had an international staff with an LGBTQ profile
Sure.
in your risk assessment under the broad heading of inclusion. Would you include them in your risk assessment based on their risk profile?
Okay, so it wouldn't start that way. I think it would start from that's an interesting one, because nobody comes with a label, and so I mean I could. It's difficult to give like example without pointing to specific But what I want to say here is that I think where we have to be careful is when an organization is also seen as promoting some values that are foreign to the country of operation, and that's actually where the real trick is. That's where the real tension is between your staff in country that suddenly are going to look at you or the organization in a way that is, okay, what are you trying to do here? Because this is actually putting me also in danger with regard to my own network, with regard to maybe my own community. So you need to have this conversation at one point, but hopefully before incidents rather than after. But there have been some points of tensions, even beyond LGBTIQ plus, I would say, where this had not been well anticipated, either on the side of the person, the colleague, but also from the institution perspective. And this always ends up in being an incident that needs to be managed. Yes. I don't have the real. It's tricky. I don't have a solution to that, because most of the time I think we are exposed to this when it's almost too late.
But I think the other way as well is, I mean, if you're looking at security risk management in a general with a broad stroke, you could have particular events, threats that are highlighted without being very specific about whether you do have a staff or not that fits these characteristics. And you could have a second one, which is, as Jean-Phillipe said, people don't come with label, but then people may raise the point. Now, I am of that particular, I have this particular characteristic, right? Am I of a particular risk? And that's where we would call it a personal security risk assessment. It would be a different system. There is the general security risk management for a particular area of operation. But then if people come forward and then would say, I've read something about either a cultural, a context specific, a legislation, right, that I believe would put me at risk. What should we do about it? And then you could do a personal security risk assessment that would be for that particular individual. Now that the characteristic came out on the person, and then come up with measures. It can go to particular security measures in the environment, or it can go as high as saying it is not the right deployment, is not the right fit in that particular area, because you're making that person get to an unacceptable level of risk. And that's the two ways to look at it. So again, I don't know if I've answered the question.
That's very post factum. I think what we've been trying to work on, and that's very recent, and that's also based on all these exchanges that we're having, but also seeing at how the organization is evolving, the type of incidents and the type of situations we were faced with. It all justifies what we're trying to do from a systemic perspective, which is to have as much information as possible before, so that, as Mark was also saying, and that's also, if you guys remember the video that Catherine Prumridge led last year, that we contributed to, with the deployment aspect, where the security manager at the end asks the right questions, which are you aware of this? You received those documents, and basically, what else do you need? Like, how can I help you with more information? So that's more the prior, I would say, pre-deployment aspects that I think all organizations need to have a closer look at, because that's not that easy. Again, we don't want to label people. We don't want to, and that's not about collecting data as well on people for that, but making sure that you have the right profile based on the right skills for that specific project.
Just a quick follow-up, then there's sort of a dynamic tension. So in our organization currently, we're reviewing our DEI process. We want to get more diverse staffing. But there seems to be a bit of a dynamic tension between the imperative by HR to hire a broader, open sort of recruitment process of anyone of any color, any LGBTQ status, gender identity, whatever, and then security risk management, which is almost profiling, depending on the nature of your organization, how you work, what is the ideal profile for the way we work. And so you have that dynamic tension between the incentive to go down the DEI path, but the profile of who your primary market is and the type of operations you do. And then reconciling those two. So you recruit these people and then tell them, well, sorry, you're not the right profile to send to that particular country context because of A, B, and C.
I would also offer directly to your point that what we see in the US government, given that, and I know this doesn't apply to everybody, but we're prohibited by law from making decisions about who gets job assignments based on the color of their skin, based on their orientation, based on their religion, right? We don't have a choice because what we're doing is discriminating. But the piece I think that speaks to everybody here potentially is that we don't see a lot of great reporting on discrimination issues or vulnerability issues overseas, because most of our staff recognize the way to advance in the organization is to get field deployments and to go to dangerous places, right? So we don't see disclosures of some threats or risks or vulnerabilities because they are afraid of being excluded, right? And not sent on a mission because their profile is a higher risk. And while I haven't heard a conversation in my organization, I've never heard, we can't send this person. I've never heard it happen. But the perception of our employees, our staff, is that they're afraid that that conversation's happening and they don't see it, they don't hear it. So they don't talk about some of these concerns, right? And I think that speaks directly to transparency and trust. So I'll stop there.
I think bottom line is this is not new. I mean, I think those conversations happen even. I mean, even I joined the humanitarian work. I remember hearing colleagues about this and explaining how they were behaving. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to behavior. What is expected behavior based on the values of your organization? And if any individual sees that as, okay, you know, I'm representing my organization here, and this is the role and responsibilities that I have, and I need to behave a certain way. And it's not about pushing a personal agenda about who am I as an individual, because I think that this is more important than the organization's mandate I work for. And I think that's actually a real personal tension that maybe some people also feel subjected to. I don't know if it's also a generational change. That's also something that we need to take into account. Lots of things as well pushed lots of information that did not exist before that are now here present in the ether of the internet. People not really paying attention to what is on the net when it comes to their own individuality. I mean, today, you know, we basically we need, when we go to the field, we need to make sure that our social medias on network or whatever we put out there is not really pointing fingers into maybe subjects that or themes that would not be well received in the location where we are going to work. And then, so that's a lot of it for me is about what can we do pre-deployment when it comes to making sure that the information is out there and people, like, it's part of informed consent, but they also understand that this is everybody's responsibility to behave accordingly and to be able to say, okay, you know what, I won't be able to actually work in this country because what I perceive as their values do not match my values today. And okay, fair enough. But it's best to have a process that allows that conversation before rather than having to deal with the consequences after.
Sorry, Christine is a HR expert. So be very keen.
And I noticed you've got some questions in chat as well. Okay. Do you think how you perceive discrimination and safety. I mean, do you see them as equals? Like, you know, do you see as one as more important than the other? I have an answer for it. I just wondered what you, because I'm sensing that we're fearful of discriminating when safety comes first. In HR, we would never recruit anyone that had a risk profile to a role and be very, very comfortable with that legally. So, you know, I just want to, we would never send, I mean, I'm going to be really, I just want to be benign about this because we can talk about someone's medical health much more easily, but I wouldn't send someone who wasn't fit to work with a heart risk to a remote environment, just wouldn't do it. So, because the risk is too high to their health. So I'm using that as a parallel to some of the conversations you're having, some of the characteristics that we talk about. Yeah, I just want to throw that in. Let's not be fearful about someone's safety. It comes first. Okay, that's all I want to say.
That's really interesting because I was just wanted to mention this. Like if somebody has a heart failure, we are also not going to send someone where their hospitals are not at a certain standard. So I think it's the same with other risks, and it depends on how high they are. If the mitigation measures are acceptable for the person and the organization to be sent out, yes or no. And I think they're the same here with certain profiles. You can then, for example, if we talk about specific risks, we had situations for example, in South Sudan where there was a lot of sexual assault, and we just decided to protect our female staff for a certain moment in time and not send them out to the field. That's a temporary solution. But hiring people, what I just was mentioning, we are not sending Amhara people to Tigray region at a certain moment in time. So I think it comes really with the persons to understand what the organization does. So that, again, the transparency, but also the trust that this is actually there to protect them. And also that the informed consent, like, yes, I'm aware about what is expected from me to do. I know these risks are there. Certain nationalities, sending them out, for kidnap cases, there are more challenges because of ransom demands and so on. For other nationalities, that's something, if it's known and understood, that's where the dialogue starts. And I think this is where you really can sort of ensure that you have inclusion within your security risk management setup, and the role of human resources is very, very important here.
And just one from the Steve Dennis case that NRC learned was this informed consent piece. Yes, great, inform people, but make sure they have the competence to understand the consent they're signing to, because some people just want the job, yeah.
All right, we just have a question that popped on the chat. So, do you think donors should have a specific role in promoting a person-centered approach to SRM in NGOs programming? What is USAID positioning regarding financing DOC for NGOs partner that includes staff mental well-being? So there are two questions here. The first one is about promoting person-centered approach to SRM in NGO programming.
We think this question is directed at me. I would say the first part of that question, I would be very interested in hearing what the room thinks on that, because as a donor, and I'm not, let's be clear, I don't actually sign the checks. The money doesn't come from me, right? But I speak with an outsized voice here. So I would very much appreciate anybody speaking to that first piece. Is anybody afraid of donors taking a role in that, right? Or does anybody have anything they want to cheer for or shout against? I would love for the room to hear that and to hear it myself. But I just have a colleague who just stepped in, Lauren Demore, who is one of the grant portfolio managers. So maybe she'll help me weigh in on this. But I would like to play a role in promoting the person-centered approach and elevating this conversation. What I don't want to do is the second part of that. I don't want to set a level of care, a duty of care as a donor. I don't think that it's well. You talked earlier about the center of gravity being in the headquarters, right? I work with a certain number of people who think that Washington, D.C. is the center of the universe. right? And I'm acutely sensitive to that. I wouldn't want Washington, D.C. setting a standard for all of your organizations. It would be poorly informed. It would not go well. And our safety and security plan review system, our proposal guidelines, have each individual organization, you set your own threshold of risk. You do your own contextual analysis. You know what your own duty of care is. What I'd like to be is a cheerleader for that, right? I would like to be a champion for making sure every organization has a very deep and honest conversation with their employees. Part of our work with GISF is about making that discussion as deep as possible and giving as many tools to the NGO world as possible. How do you analyze this risk? You know, what are the best practices in the entire industry? I would love to talk about that all day. I wouldn't want the US government setting that duty of care. And my lawyer tells me I can't even talk about that. I cannot set duty of care for any of you, so don't worry. It's not going to happen. But the conversation, I'm afraid, sometimes won't start without donors raising this. And I would like, across all donors, I would like to start a conversation about, can we all at least try to stress the same things and give all of you as proposal writing NGOs a common target, sort of a common understanding of what donors would like. I would love to have that conversation. And I don't want it to set at my standard or what I think is important. I think it would definitely be informed by what the NGO community needs and wants. Does that make sense? I'm not dodging the answer, but Lauren raised her hand. She's more qualified to speak to this than I am. So please, Lauren, weigh in.
No, I think you did well, boss. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Lauren Demore. Sorry, I was in another session and we ended early, so I'm glad I was able to make it. So I like these the questions Ada has asked. Thank you, Ada. I think that to me we do have a role in a human-centered approach in all of our work if we're doing humanitarian assistance. So to me, this conversation is about continuing to align the humanitarian security sector, how we assess risk, how we support teams in a humanitarian principled way. And I think one of the best examples when we're talking about inclusion here is, of course, using the data that we have globally on humanitarian aid workers and the disproportionate number of local and national staff who are kidnapped and killed or targets of direct violence, right? And so to me, that has to be addressed in our SRMs. And I think that the framework is broad enough that there's plenty of room for that. Certainly, we as a donor are. I think we're one of the few donors that has safety and security plan requirements where the guidelines are pretty well spelled out. We also know that it's guidelines, and we want to use the best practices in the sector. So it's based on GPR8, it's based on MOS SRM. And as that evolves, we will evolve with it, maybe a little slower, but we certainly do have control of that little piece within the broader BHA donor application process. And we look at every one of them, we review every one of them. And that leads me to my second point, which is certainly we know that each organization that is taking money from accepting our grants is taking on their own duty of care and their own risk to deliver those programs. And what we say for every single applicant for our awards, whether it's emergency funding for a complex individual country, a regional crisis, even DRR, any work, any application coming across our desk, if there is the sound analysis for the context, and it's allowable, and we will support it, and we will go to bat internally with the folks who the awards officer representatives or the review lead for that specific award if they push back and we feel that there's a sound analysis there, because our partners, the places where you work and what you need, and I am saying ask for it. We also had COVID-19 is, there's a lot to be said about that. Mark and I were talking the other day about the one silver lining that we got was we broke through some of our own internal arguments about funding per award training for staff, security and safety and health training that previously was not necessarily funded by award individually, that there was an expectation that the organization should use their overhead and duty of care for heat training and all of that. The emergency guidelines for COVID broke that open for us. And I'm trying internally to make sure that we're not going to go backwards on that. So ask for training, ask for the equipment in those awards, and I know that it's really our business development colleagues, having been on the partner side before, who need to hear this. But budget for a security manager. Maybe you already have a security manager in country. Awesome. Is this project 50% of their time? Put it in there. If the analysis is there, we'll support it.
Ask a follow-up question.
Boy, put me on the spot for that
Well,
one.
and
Go ahead.
we're a little behind. We're in discussions internally with where that falls. It's a huge topic.
Yeah, and part of the reason we can't necessarily drive that conversation is because being perceived as hard skills security people or technical security people, we found COVID mitigation strategies were very difficult for us to promote because they said none of you are doctors. So I had to go and find a doctor at the US State Department to advise us, except that I thought I knew what I was talking about. These were fairly simple things like masks and testing and vaccinations, right? We're not talking rocket science here. Or the mental health support piece. We are one of the players. We have a number of people, and we're using some of our experts in protection to advance this conversation because they have a recognized technical expertise in our organization and can help us advance it. But I don't think currently we're addressing it directly.
Well, and
When you've got in your guideline, you need to have a safety and security plan. Does that say physical and mental safety?
does it explicitly? I don't know. I can tell you, we would, if that were a part of a safety and security plan in any award application, it makes sense. A whole person approach is what we support, and we would believe that that is a legitimate part of a safety and security plan, right?
I think looking at the time. And there
A question from Maggie. If time permits, could you tell us a bit more about your experience with how you engage people to put their own safety and security at center? Any specific approaches you find worked well? Dear panelist.
I've been doing a lot of talking, so I would love to hear some other voices here.
Well, I'm going to start and say that I think in both organizations I work for, I think there's been a lot of effort in order to make sure that people had all the information to be able to look at their own safety and security. So from the first inception of what I think was not even called duty of care in my previous organization, where basically we did, during the recruitment process, people were explained where they were going to go, what the context was, what the threats were, to the rather more developed UNHCR process of duty of care, where we have a thorough briefing on explaining everything from like security to accommodation to working to all the details about where you're going to be based. I think that helps people understand where they're going to fit in the system. And if this is done, and I think Jean-Phillipe was speaking about this, if this is done even prior to any decision about recruitment or any decision about joining, it's not recruitment, about joining an organization, or any decision about accepting a position or applying for a position, I think it helps put people, make them take this ownership of safety and security by saying, am I really going to go for this? Am I satisfied, one, by the answer? Am I trusting the organization? Am I indeed confident that everything is going to be taken into consideration? Now, of course, there's not zero risk is difficult, and there's always things that we need to learn. So, but what is the level of confidence? And I think that helps look at people putting their own safety and security at the center. Then the rest, what the organization does after. But the other thing, once you join the organization, and I think it could have been in one of the challenges, is to what extent security professionals today are actually receptive to people coming forward and telling them about their particular issues. So there's two things. There's how receptive security professionals are. And if the answer is not so much, then you never build this confidence that staff can come forward and tell you about their own safety and security. I think most organizations would tell you, you can come forward and tell us when you're not feeling confident, and don't worry, you will not face any issues with raising this. But I think we're not at that level. We're just at the level where people are not necessarily confident. It's not because they fear dismissal or anything. It's just like they're not confident going to speak to a security professional. And I think it goes back to everything that we've raised in the panel. It's a question of like people not responsive, people never showing this ability to go beyond what they're comfortable with in security. And therefore, if your issue does not fall within that zone of confidence of your security professionals, you don't want to go and discuss with the person, because the answer you're going to get is never going to be as good as you would expect. And so I think it's part of the work where before deployment, immediately after deployment, and then throughout your assignment, it's important to be able to have this conversation, to raise these points. And I'm not sure, and we say we were in a safe space, I'm not sure any of the organizations I work with have fully grasped this or fully succeeded, but I think everybody's working in the right direction. Maggie, I hope that answered the question. And if anybody else wants to raise a point.
Yeah, I was going to add, because it's fairly the same what we've been talking about essentially during this session. No, it's about duty of information you put out there for people to have access to before thinking about going further with their plans in a way. So of course, when we started working on the topic of the person-centered approach, one of the recommendations for us was to offer a more personal security resource center. We just had established a security wiki internally where we put all the information for managers for the different types of threats they were facing and mitigation measures and all of this. But what was missing was something a bit more for individuals. And this was kind of out of the remits of my unit, but we said, okay, we actually can provide that information, which was something that was not yet available in other parts of the organization. And we connected then afterwards with human resources as they were also working on their onboarding plan. So now, for instance, we have a page where people can go in and have access to more information on the different profile characteristics that they could find from basically accessibility to other personal risks, but also some tips about doing their own self-assessment, maybe checklist about things to think about before going on mission. And this was done in parallel to another work, which is accessible to everybody. If you actually in one of the slides, you see the ICRC released a manual for humanitarian personnel. Initially, we wanted to do this for ICRC new staff, but at the end of the day, the content is just the same for any type of humanitarian worker. So you can have access to this. It's quite thick. It's basically all the range of, from a security perspective, what you would encounter in the field as a humanitarian. And each section basically ends up with a few key questions for the reader on how they would actually prepare themselves or integrate certain aspects. So I was talking earlier about, for instance, are you sure that your Instagram or Facebook page is kind of clean before going on, what can you do to actually prepare yourself in a better way? Make sure that you have this conversation with your family as well. Like, I'm going to a context where kidnapping is a high risk. What does that mean, and how the organization will actually be tackling this? I mean, these are really key, essential things to do before doing this demanding type of work. And so you can have access to this in 5 languages. The PDF version is free, and I think you just need to control-click on one of the pictures on the slide that I showed earlier.
What I was going to ask, maybe to answer a little bit more on Maggie's question, I think today you don't have to come of MIT or Polytechnic or whatever school you want to consider to look at security risk management. And I think what I would encourage everybody to look at is, before they deploy, is to go through the process of an SRM for their own individual. This is what we call a personal security risk assessment. And so, the idea of what are the threats in the environment, what are the particular threat that I would face because of my characteristic, and what kind of mitigation measure I can already think of individually, is a first step. The second thing, and it's a bit of sometimes a taboo with security professionals, is the fact that the security risk assessment needs to be shared with staff as well. They need to understand how the evaluation has been done. And I'm not totally sure that all organizations are as transparent as they should be when it comes to sharing security risk assessments. Because the only way for a staff to understand whether the organization has done its duty is to look at this and compare it with their own security risk assessment, and then be able to engage with the security professionals on the subject and say, why is there a discrepancy? Or we're all in this together. We all agree. And then it happened to me when I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo, looking at the security risk for staff, but also because it was a family duty station for the UN, or at least in Kinshasa, engaging with the families and the children above a certain age on security, and ensuring that, whatever we do for programs, all of our measures in our security risk assessments and the mitigation measures that are coming out of it are for our programs. It's whenever staff goes to this location, we're going to do this. But what do I advise a spouse going to a school with children in an environment which has been determined as a family duty station, but still carries a fair amount of threats and risks to dependents? So it's this constant discussion that I think we need to have, and it's part of the inclusion of another profile. It's not only staff, it's families whenever it's acceptable that families are deployed. It's partners, and this is on another topic. So I have a feeling that it was an inclusion in SRM session, but it opened so many other subjects that we can discuss on. But I think it's a little bit. It's 10 to 4 now. I think we don't have any more question in the chat. I can still see that people are here, so maybe you got a last chance. And ultimately, I'd like to thank the panelists waiting for a potential other question, and thank you all for attending. And I guess we need another session on HR and security, another one on diversity of the workforce, which would be a security realm.
If I could offer one last point.
Yeah.
30 seconds, I promise.
Sure.
What all of you are talking about is making safety and security, and this is to answer that last question, or the second to the last question. You're talking about relevant and useful, right? So the first thing for me is each individual employee needs to feel like safety and security plans and regulations are relevant and useful to their situation, right? The other piece I would also say, especially for anybody here who's in leadership, is try not to make safety and security about enforcement and compliance. Because if you transparently share that risk assessment, you're describing to people why they need to do these things, right? So it's a conversation. If it's typically perceived, especially in my former tribe of police and military running security, it becomes all about rules and the consequences of breaking rules. And it's not a good model for, I think, civilians and NGOs. It's really not about rules, right? We want to protect people. And we don't want to protect them from themselves because that's disrespectful and it infantilizes them potentially. But yeah, so I would say in any organization, try to stay away from you do need to audit your programs. You need to know that there's compliance, but when you present to your constituency, the people you're actually trying to protect, keep the enforcement mindset out of it.
Yeah. And I would say, I mean, a bit of a summary of all this is the session, the way I looked at it was the inclusion of particular threats into security risk management, diversity of our workforce. How do we cater to all the particular threats? But I would say the very beginning of it should be the inclusion of all the staff in the process itself, not necessarily their threats, but making sure that people are aware of everything that's happening at every step. It's the person-centered approach. Is putting back the beneficiary of security at the very inception of the security risk assessment. And I think that's the at least that's what I would that's how I would summarize it, and make sure that that all of our colleagues are fully aware what they're going to face, but also what all of us are facing as an organization. And so this transparency, this inclusion, explaining everything, as you said, you can't, I always used to say that you can't justify a measure for people to comply with if you don't explain to them where it came from to start. And so basically all of this for me is part of this inclusion, is an important topic, which I'm sure we can discuss next HNPW, with new lesson learned after a year. Susan, last word.
No, and as basic as it is, in the LWF, it starts with the interviewing of the candidates, providing a security question or case study, or seeing whether the person is bringing it up herself or himself. That's where you already start to say, okay, is the person aware about the specific context the person will go to? What is the experience? What has been the background in this? This is where actually I think recruitment is very important. And just in another element, and this is more related to the question on the donors, we had a very interesting discussion with some of our donors in Asia recently, and we had an issue about a session about staff resilience. And also the fact of, this was specifically for our staff in the Myanmar context, that are really having a hard time. Of course, we know how the situation is there. And the cumulative stress level also, of course, has impact on the way they are managing security. So I think the relation between that, and I really would hopefully, looking forward to have more understanding of that, because that session we did with some of our donors from Australia, from the US, it was an eye-opener for them to understand what's actually the reality on the ground that they're facing. How does it impact all of the work they are doing? I think, it's related. So I think that was a very important element too, to continue sharing the reality on the ground, as you said, practical things. It's not be imposed. It's just the fact that what's happening now, how would that impact the situation? Thank you.
So thank you very much. And the session is now adjourned. Thank you all. Thank you.